Now, we're going to continue our sermon series. If you've been following us for the last few weeks, you know that we've been in a mini-series, a short 5-week series called Changing Landscape. In the first few weeks, we talked about why this mission that we're talking about is so important and what that mission looks like. We've also discussed in the last couple weeks especially what the changing landscape or the changing mission field looks like. We talked about the rise of the nuns a couple of weeks ago, and just last week we talked about Generation Z. And I've been hearing some great feedback and responses with you guys. I've been actually able to engage in lots of meaningful conversations, and so I'm very encouraged and thankful for all of us being interested in this changing landscape, in this changing mission field. We're going to continue in our series, and now for the last 2 Sundays, this Sunday and next Sunday, we're going to talk about how we can be missionally effective. We've laid down what the changing landscape looks like. We've shown and shared statistics, and we've shared stories of how this changing landscape is impacting us. But now let's dig deeper into how we can, as a church, be effective missionaries to this changing landscape, to the community that's all around us. Now, in order to do that, we've broken it into 2 parts. This Sunday, we're going to kind of zoom out and take a look at the bigger picture of what posture we need to have, what kind of attitude we need to have engaging in this culture. But also next Sunday, it's going to be highly practical. You're going to be able to really see how you can participate in this mission in a very, very tangible way. So please come back next Sunday. It's going to be our sermon series closer, and we're going to actually really have fun with how we can practically engage in this mission. But today, let's take that step back, and let's zoom out a bit, and let's look at how we can tackle this changing landscape. We've entitled this sermon, Burger versus Curry, so I'm wondering if you've been curious about this all series long. You'll get to finally find out what that's all about. But before we get there, let's continue from where we left off last Sunday. Last Sunday, if you were here, we left off by saying, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. We've left off there because we said Generation Z has all this access to information, more access to information than any other generation. As a matter of fact, more than all the generations combined. They have so much information at their disposal, and yet there aren't many mentors who guide them through biblical wisdom on how to navigate all that information. So we said, okay, we need to become mentors for this younger generation that's coming up. And we said we need to be like Paul, pointing people to Jesus Christ. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. So we should ask ourselves, what does that look like? What does it actually look like to be a mentor that points to Christ? What does it look like to be an imitator that imitates Jesus? So this is where it gets kind of tricky, because a lot of us might be like, okay, sign me up, Paul. But we don't know what that looks like. So before we delve into what it looks like, let me just share why imitation is so important. There's an author named James K.A. Smith. He wrote a book called You Are What You Love, The Spiritual Power of Habit. And he discusses there the approach of habits being changed. And he says, in order to change a habit or develop new habits, you need to really intentionally have 2 things. You need opportunities for imitation and practice. Next Sunday, we'll get to the practice part. For this Sunday, we're going to focus on the imitation part. Sometimes that word has negative connotations. Imitation means fake. But really, imitation in education can be a really valuable thing. Let me just give you an illustration of this. A few weeks ago, Sarah and I, my wife Sarah and I, and our little 2-year-old boy Nathan, we were able to move into Tawasin, and we got to enjoy this community that we love. We're so thankful for the opportunity to be closer to our church family, and more important, really, to be a part of the mission field that we're in together. It is fantastic. We were able to find a home, and we moved in, and everything was great. Even though the timing of it was September, and my wife's a teacher in an elementary school, so September is always a busy season. They could have added stress because you're starting a new school year. And for us at the church, it's also a busy season. So it wasn't probably the best, if we were to choose, that probably wasn't the best time to move, but we did it anyways. And we thought, okay, the move is done. It was great. And now we put Nathan into his brand new room. The trouble is, a 2-year-old, I guess, has a hard time adjusting to new environments. So he started to not sleep well. Before, in our little condo, we would put him to his crib, and he would just sleep just fine. And now, he's actually battling with us for hours before he's able to put himself to sleep. And it's been like that for the last few weeks. And imagine a couple weeks of this, of no sleep, especially for Sarah, sadly. And after that, we have a busy work schedule. This is a difficult time of the year anyways. And after all of that added complications, we were exhausted physically. So one night, I'm helping Sarah and I are putting Nathan to bed again, and we know this is going to be a hard battle again. And as we are, reading stories, doing the bedtime routine, what happened was I actually fell asleep on the floor. Now, before you think I'm a bad father or a bad husband, Sarah was she was a little bit upset. She said, "Paul, you're not being helpful here. I'm tired too. You can't fall asleep on me." And I was offended by that because I said, "Sarah, do you think I'm trying to sleep here because I'm tired? I'm sacrificially giving of myself because imitation is so important in education." I even quoted to her, there's this author named James K.A. Smith. And in this book, on page whatever, we find that imitation is absolutely necessary for children to learn. This is why I don't want to sleep on a floor, on a carpet, but look, I'm giving an example of what it looks like to have good sleep. And of course, Sarah wasn't really buying it. I wasn't really buying it either. I just needed an excuse. I felt bad. But something funny happened. Nathan came over, and he lay down beside me, and he says, I sleep. And he actually fell asleep beside me on the floor. I was like, wow, this thing really works. It's surprising how imitation is a powerful tool. We use it for parenting. We use it at schools. We use it as a part of education all the time. In our spiritual walk, the Bible is teaching us through Paul, be imitators of Jesus. Be a good source of imitation for these people who don't know how to navigate this world. Show them how Christ has shown us to live in this world to glorify Him. This has been an example. It's such a valuable and rich example that thousands of years have gone by, and we still look to it as our example to imitate. This is such a gift to us from God. So when we ask, let's be a good role model, let's be a good mentor for these younger generations, then we should also be asking, what are we asking them to imitate? What is it that we're asking them to follow? Because then we need to really clearly lay that out. Is this things like, habits and traditions that we have? Things like, on Sundays you should go to church and worship God. You shouldn't swear. You shouldn't get drunk. You should tithe. Are these the things, are these the traditions and habits that we present to the next generation to imitate? And yes, I hope we're all setting a good example in all these areas. I think that's very important. But if that's all we're asking for them to imitate, if that's all we're presenting as the good news, as the hope of this world, then it's just not that compelling. Let's be honest. We saw the video from our very own Generation Z. One of the young ladies in that video said her peers find Christianity just a bunch of rules, and it's restrictive. And remember, one of the characteristics of the Generation Z generation, that they highly value individual freedom. And when we just present it as a bunch of rules, and we don't explain why this rule is actually relevant to our life, why it's beneficial to us and glorifying to God, then we actually do not make a compelling case for them to understand these rules or even try to follow them. So if all we're doing is presenting a bunch of rules and say, just follow them, that's how you become a Christian, then we've actually stripped the gospel of all its power. And we don't ever say it like this, but we've actually watered it down. When we think of watering down the gospel, we think of, let's get rid of all the rules. But no, you can water down the gospel by keeping all the rules and yet not getting to the heart of the gospel. That's what the Pharisees did in the early church. In the early Christian, the birthing of Christianity in the first century, the Pharisees struggled with this. They just presented as traditions and rules. And they forgot God's plan in all of this, God's love for all of us. And it really stripped them of all the power that's behind the gospel, so they never actually got to experience it. So when we ask the next generation, or anyone for that matter, when we ask them to imitate us so that they can learn what it looks like to be of Christ, be His possession, then we shouldn't be just telling them about rules, or just telling them that this is how you become a Christian, just follow after me. There's an example that Jesus actually gave. There's a formula to growing as a disciple of Christ. And here it is in Romans chapter 5, verse 8. If If you turn to Romans chapter 5, verse 8, this is a pivotal verse in today's sermon. It says, "But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." In other translations of this verse, it says, God demonstrates his love for us. While we were still sinners, he died for us. This is the way in which God shows or demonstrates his love. When he says, imitate me, when he's telling us Christians to imitate him, this is the example that he's asking us to imitate. This is how you demonstrate my love to the entire world. You sacrifice yourself. You lay yourself down for the world. Because that's what Christ did. This is how he showed the world. This is how he showed us that he loved us. That's how he demonstrated. So sacrifice is the key to our mission. If we're taking a big picture view of how we can be effective in our mission field, the underlying thing has to be sacrifice. Sacrifice is what will unlock the power of the gospel. As we sacrifice and engage in it, we will be pointing people to the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And then they will see that this is truly valuable. Even in texts like Matthew chapter 16 or Mark chapter 8, Jesus says this himself. Jesus says, if anyone is to come after me, if anyone wants to follow me, then let him deny himself, take up the cross, and follow me. So the formula that Jesus himself gives is deny yourself, take up that cross, and follow me. This is the example that he left for us. And here, we're going to go to the whiteboard again. Hopefully I don't drop any pens this time. But think about this world. This world and this culture, the dominant discourse is flowing in a certain direction. And this happens all the time. They always happen to have this trend. We have this trend of people having a discourse, and our value systems are driven by it. Now, a couple weeks ago in the sermon called Rise of the Nuns, we learned that Christians were no longer the driving force behind this direction. We are kind of on the fringes now, so our values and our principles from the Bible aren't driving society's values. They're not driving the direction of the society. So, if everyone is going this way, I would like to just simplify it and say the direction that we've emphasized as culture is self. It's self. If you were to ask me, what do you think is the biggest idol in today's Western culture? I would say it's self. We have made everything about us, from birthday parties ever since you were a baby, all the way to how you manage your finances or your time. Self is the most important factor for many of the people in our society. And you might say, no, I don't agree with you, Paul, because our generation engages in more philanthropy than ever before. And I have heard those statistics, and they would be accurate. Except there's a few factors for that. We give more because, frankly, we are wealthier than ever before. There's so much more that we can give. But even when we do give generously, the underlying motive behind all of that is take care of yourself first, and then take care of your family, and with what's left, don't be greedy, help others out. So I'm not saying helping others isn't a high value, it's just not the highest value. The highest value is still on self. Our cultural discourse is based on self, and we see examples of this all the time. Whether it's in education, whether it's in corporate worlds, whether it's even in your family, that there is this tendency that we emphasize ourselves, that keeping us safe is more important, and then we can keep others safe. That we should not risk our life or our own safety for the safety of others. There's this underlying fear or discomfort with that. But let me just share with you an example from recent history of how this was challenged. There was a shooting in February, on Valentine's Day actually, in Florida. I don't know if you guys all remember what happened in a high school in Florida. There was a terrible shooting that killed, I think, 17 people at the time. It was a tragedy. And it's sad that we're seeing more and more of these, it seems like. And yet I found this Facebook post about one of the teachers that were involved in this shooting. He actually died in the shooting. But here's a Facebook post as a tribute to him. One of the people on Facebook wrote this on a site. He writes, "Teacher. Turn to any dictionary, and it is defined as a person who instructs students. That's it. That's all it says. That's what we thought a teacher was. How wrong we were. This is Scott Bagel, a geography teacher at the high school in Florida where a gunman opened fire on a peaceful Wednesday afternoon. When the shots rang out, he did exactly as he was trained to do, get his kids secure in the classroom and lock the door. But Scott did something else. When he saw other children running in horror from the gunfire down the hallway, he put his own life at risk by opening his classroom door and ushering them in. He saved them. Before he could secure his own life, however, he was hit with a bullet and killed. Make no mistake, he traded his life for theirs. This is Scott Bagel, a teacher. In his last moments on this earth, he taught his students the most incredible lesson any of us can ever learn. He taught them that he loved them. Every time there seems to be a tragic story like this, as the story unfolds, there almost always seems to be this beautiful story that also arises. It's sad that this man lost his life, and yet there's this beauty in his sacrifice that the whole world recognizes. When the whole world is heading towards this direction, when we counterculturally go the other way, what happens is, in the most literal sense of the word, we become outstanding. We stand out. People take notice. This is why sacrifice is so important to us. Biblically, because God teaches that, but also practically because, of course, God is wiser than we are. He knows what works. Sacrifice is important in this changing landscape because we talked about how Generation Z values authenticity. The younger people have been shown a phony version of Christianity, whether it was people in power and authority who were Christians who abused that power, in all the hashtag Me Too movements that we see. There were disappointments where we misrepresented Christ to people. And they discount anyone who is willing to share the gospel with them because that's what they think of. They don't see authenticity behind the message of hope that we bring. So they just see us as a part of the trend. And yet, when we go the other way, when we offer our sacrifice to the Lord, and we show that we're willing to sacrifice for this, they see something standing out. It authenticates the message. It tells them these guys aren't hypocrites. They're for real. They're serious about this. And remember a couple weeks ago, we talked about the rise of the nuns. How the ringing the church bells won't work anymore because just ringing the bells don't get people coming in. It just don't work. It just doesn't work anymore. So what happens is instead of just ringing the church bell and waiting and complaining that these guys aren't taking notice because everyone has tuned out that church bell, instead of that, we say, let's show this world what the gospel is truly all about, what these set of rules actually point to. The ultimate sacrifice in Jesus Christ on the cross. So when we lay ourselves down and partake in that sacrifice and that suffering willingly, the world takes notice. When we, as disciples of Jesus, deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow after Jesus, the world actually stops and notices. The world stops and celebrates a man like Scott Bagel who risked his own life to save others. Apparently there were 3 teachers or coaches in this high school that actually lost their life trying to protect their students. And ironically, all 3 of them had children of their own at home. It is tragic. I'm not saying this is good. I don't wish that upon anyone. And yet, they didn't say, I have my own kids at home that I need to take care of, so I'm not going to put my life in danger. They actually risked their own lives and the opportunity for their children to have a father at home. They laid all that down and did what they felt was the right thing to do in the moment. And the entire world took notice because it's so countercultural. It stands out so much. the world honors and celebrates these moments. The world hasn't lost these values. We've just drowned them out with our cultural discourse of emphasis on self, that we forgot to actually emphasize it. So let's show the world through our sacrifice that we're serious about this mission. That we really do believe that Jesus came to redeem the world. That we really do believe that there is a kingdom of God that's coming, the perfect kingdom that will restore us, redeem us, perfect us. When we see, this is why when some people say, hey, Paul, you've already preached quite a few sermons on giving and serving, and you've only been lead pastor for just a few months. What's going on here? Don't you feel awkward about preaching about it? I say no. No, I love those sermon texts in the Bible that emphasize giving of yourself, whether it's money or time or anything else. Because if I were a pastor who never challenged the congregation to give sacrificially, then I would be robbing you of the experience, the empowering experience of what the gospel is all about. I would be stripping away the power of the gospel right before you, and you should fire me for that. So when I challenge you to give sacrificially, I'm challenging you because I do believe that that's the best way for us to engage in this mission to the Generation Z, to the rise of the nuns, for us to show people and make them stop in their everyday lives where all of us are directed to, my family first, me first, and they all stop and pause because they're like, wow, these guys sacrifice their money, their time, their everything for this gospel. What is this gospel all about? Why are they willing to lay down their lives for this? Now, let me address that not all of us will have the opportunity to have these epic moments, life-changing moments of sacrifice, like this teacher did. I always pray that one day maybe I will get this opportunity. Maybe not in this situation per se. My prayer is that God, do not let me be so caught up in fear or ignorance that I would not respond in a way that honors and glorifies you. More than my prayer that this situation would not arise, my prayer is actually, God, when the time comes for me to give my sacrifice that's meaningful, that will stop the world and make them pay attention to your words, may I have the courage and boldness. May your Spirit fill me so that I may say amen. That I might not put myself first, but that I would put your glory before even my own life. That's my prayer. And that's, I hope, our prayer at SDBC. And yet, not all of us will be given this route of sacrificing. Many of us will be given opportunities to sacrifice in the smaller moments of life that still make a huge impact. Let me explain what we're talking about. God showcases his power and his love for us in his sacrifice. He demonstrates it that way. So let me give you the illustration that became the sermon title, Burger versus Curry. Let's say we have a missionary that we sent to, India. Let's choose a country. We're sending a missionary there, and we're supporting that missionary financially with prayer and attention and everything. We do that, by the way. Our church is very good at supporting our missionaries. But let's imagine this missionary is on fire for God, on the grounds, and he's sharing his love, God's love, and God's message, and people start to take notice, and a young man comes up to him and says, hey, I've been noticing as you were working with us, I've been noticing something different about you. And you always talk about this gospel, this Jesus thing, and I'm actually curious about it. I want to hear you out. Can you share with me sometime? So the missionary goes, thank you, God. This is what I've been praying for. All right, so tomorrow for lunch, I'll take you out to lunch. I'll buy you lunch. Meet me at this burger joint down the street. I would love for you to come and engage with me. I'll share the whole gospel with you. And this man says, wait, no. I said I wanted the gospel. I hate burgers. I don't want a burger. I don't want a burger. Right? I prefer curry. Let's meet at a curry joint and we'll have our discussion there. What if this missionary said, no. I really love my burger. I got to have my In-N-Out. Let's do burger. Okay? No curry, just burger. what would we say? And the young man comes back and says, no, I really can't do burgers. Give me my curry. I will buy you lunch, but let's go to a curry place. Share with me the gospel. I'm begging you. And the missionary says, nope. No. If you're not willing to go to a burger joint with me, forget it. You're not getting the gospel. How would we feel about this missionary at our sending church? Do we keep him on? No. There must be some accountability. We find this a very silly example, right? This should never happen. I don't think it ever happens. I hope it doesn't happen. How many of you prefer burgers over curry as a lunch meal? You can be honest. Don't worry. How many of you prefer curry over burgers? Oh, wow, look at that. Even split. I prefer both. I'm easy. I'll go anywhere. But wouldn't we tell that missionary, suck it up, just go. You don't even have to eat. Dude, just order some naan bread and just sit there and listen to the guy and share with him the gospel. There's so much more important things at stake. Why would you let curry get in the way of a gospel moment? It is so ridiculous that we would be all up in arms if this actually happened in real life. We would be demanding a reason for that action. And yet, we said at the beginning of the series, we are missionaries to our mission field right here in our home. And let's be honest, do we not do this in our everyday moments of our lives? When it gets uncomfortable, or when it doesn't jive well with our preferences or our ways of doing things, we say, no, I will not go to those places. You can come to our church, and then I'll share with you the gospel. See, we got so good at the home game and neglected the away game that I think the church in the West have been so much better at inviting people and sharing the gospel here. But we have become really ineffective in actually going and sharing the gospel there, where the actual people are. We need to learn from missionaries that there will be those burger versus curry moments in our lives. It may not show up in the way of a burger versus a curry, but it may show up in many different ways in our lives. Just think about your own moments. What are some of the things that are obstacles for you? What are some of the things that's holding you back? Let me illustrate this point. So, after this series, we're going into the book of Acts. Because we think the pre-Christendom church in the book of Acts is actually very similar to the post-Christian church that we're facing today. I know there's more extreme persecution there, but I think there's so much to learn from the church in the book of Acts because of some of the similar things that we'll face. So we're going to go into a new sermon series after this. But let me just give you a context behind the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, we have this guy named Paul. And he is a famous evangelist. He's a famous missionary. And he is all on fire for this mission. He is risking his life for it. He literally died for this mission. He's on fire for God. And he was able to engage the culture. He was sent to the foreigners who didn't have any context about Jesus. But in those times, you have to remember the diaspora was happening. And so what happened was there were actually more Jewish people outside of the Palestine area than inside of it. And this is interesting because wherever they went, they started to set up, if you had a few Jewish men, they started a synagogue and they started to gather, and early Christians would share the gospel. They would be missional. But the challenge to early Christians being missional in all these synagogues and areas, in these communities, was that there were some obstacles. So much so that there's a term called God-fearers. These are people who heard the message of the gospel, who heard about Jesus and, potentially Christianity. And what they did was, okay, I'm going to interact with you. I'm going to go to your synagogues, maybe worship your God together. I believe in your God. I think this is good. And this was actually reasonable to expect because in the first century in the Greco-Roman culture, there were some factors that made Christianity very compelling. For example, Christianity taught that there was one God. Monotheism was actually trendy back then. It was actually compelling. People actually at the time started to like the idea of one God. So when Christianity came, there is one God, the Trinitarian God. They were compelled by this. And of course, they had Christian ethics were emphasized, high moral values. And because of that, they were actually compelled by it, because the popular thought of philosophy at the time in the Greco-Roman world was Stoicism. And Stoicism was a lot about ethics. And because Christians valued ethics and they put a high emphasis on it, this was actually a compelling thing for the people in the first century. In Greco-Roman culture, monotheism, Christian ethics, and the fact that this was from the Orient, it was kind of viewed as this exotic thought, this mysterious thing from the East. And that was actually very trendy as well. It was compelling. It's like, I guess, equivalent to having like a hipster movement. It was viewed like, oh, that's very cool. If you're from the East, I wonder if that's why you guys hired me. Like, I'm from the Orient, I guess. But it was just trendy. So all these things made the God-fearers compelled to this message that some of these Christians were sharing, and yet they had roadblocks. They had obstacles. Namely, things like food law, the rules around Sabbath, and of course, circumcision. If you're a man, you can understand why circumcision would be a big roadblock. For these people who heard the message and they were compelled by it, they kind of couldn't get over some of these things, like, oh man, your food laws. I like what you're saying. I'm starting to believe what you're saying is true, and yet your food laws, your laws around Sabbath, and this thing about circumcision is really, I don't know if I can go there. So they kind of engage, but kind of don't. They never become proselytes. They stay as God-fearers. And you know what Paul did? The greatest missionary that we hold as a hero in the Christian world? You know what Paul did? He went around. He went around in first century Greco-Roman culture. He went around everywhere telling people that these rules aren't what defines what Christ has done for you. There's so much more than that. There's so much more power and grace and love in the message that we bring to you. Do not allow these things to stand in your way. He actually goes so far as to confronting Peter, one of the great apostles at the time, to say, hey, remember, Jesus isn't all about this. We got to move forward. We got to help these people get over these humps, these hang-ups that they have. We got to get them over it to actually encounter Jesus, because that's more important than all of these things. These things were made so that it would point to Christ, not to hold people back from committing to Him. So Paul goes around leading people, mentoring them through, guiding them with some of these hang-ups that they had, and moving them towards a rich, life-changing experience with Christ. A relationship that changes lives and that eventually changed the world. This movement literally changed the Roman Empire. Think about that. But they had to get through some of these things. Now, please don't hear me saying, let's water down our doctrine. I'm not saying we should negotiate on things like the deity of Jesus. I'm not saying, let's say the God, you can believe in any God and you can go to heaven. I'm not saying that. I'm not asking you to compromise what the Bible teaches about Jesus, but I am asking us to lay down our burgers. If our preferences are getting in the way of people engaging with us, then we need to lay those down. I've heard one of the saddest things I heard when I came to this church. When I was at the Connect Desk as part of the hospitality team, I remember one Sunday, a lady walked into the church and she said, hey, I have my 2 sons. I'm going to drop them off in your children's program here, and I'm just going to go home. I was like, wait, what? Why wouldn't you engage with us in worship? No, I'll just wait in the car. No, you can come in. We welcome you. Do you need us to explain what's going on here? Are you new to church? No. I've been to church before. I just can't go in because I don't have my makeup on and I'm not dressed properly. This was a real encounter. Somewhere along the way, not just our church, but the church in the West, at least, We have communicated to the world that is a very important thing. And if you're not ready to engage with us in the proper attire, then don't come. Somewhere along the world of Christianity, this has been communicated. If clothing is holding people back from having a relationship with Jesus, we need to allow them to overcome those obstacles and come and have a relationship with Christ. We got so good in raising the barrier to come meet Jesus with our laws, with our traditions, with our preferences. And in the early church, when that was happening, Paul did everything in his power to show them that's not what we're about. There's something so much more rich in the gospel news of Jesus Christ. And we will not allow the message of Jesus Christ to be defined by those things. Amen. This is what it looks like to be missional. It's actually not asking you or me to water down the gospel. It's actually for us to really fully be understanding of what the doctrine is. We have to be really sharp. And we have to challenge ourselves to really learn the doctrine even more. Because we need to understand what are those things that we cannot compromise on. What are those things that we can actually say, I can go to you on that one. This is a burger and curry kind of thing. I can meet you there. If you're not comfortable coming here, I'll go to you. Let me bring the gospel with me. Let's be that church. Let's be that church where we are willing to not only sacrifice in those epic moments like that teacher, but also in the everyday little things of our lives, where we say, how can I meet you where you are with the gospel of Christ Jesus our Lord? How can we go on those away games and actually be effective in them? I think if we are motivated by guilt, this would never work. But here's what should motivate us. If you think about how Jesus actually did this, how God sent his son as the original missionary, I want you to think about, imagine if you can fathom the distance between the throne room of heaven all the way to the cross. If this is the throne of heaven, and if that's the cross, how vast is that gap? How far did God come to engage us with this gospel? Let me read from Philippians 2. Let me finish there. In Philippians 2, it says, do nothing from rivalry or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others, being countercultural. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. We have to remember that distance from the throne room of heaven to this earth didn't end with just him putting on flesh. You thought that was radical? You thought that was crazy that God would put on flesh, and it is? He went a step further and he carried the cross. In a shame and honor culture in first century Palestine, that was actually going the farthest you could ever go. There was more shame in being crucified on a cross than being a tax collector or a prostitute. Jesus went the greatest distance that we can even fathom. All because he loved us that much. He counted his heavenly throne as not something for him to grasp. But he loved us more, so he came. He came and left his comfort zone. He was sent by the Father so that we would have life in him. So when we ask what should motivate us to this kind of mindset, it's this. It's the fact that Jesus cares about this mission than any of us could ever care. is that Jesus demonstrated to us the distance that he covered to get here. It's that Jesus led by example in sacrificing his own life for all of us. This is why we're asking ourselves, how far can we go to pursue these people who need the hope of Christ? How far are we willing to participate with Christ in pursuing these people who need the love of God? That should fire us up. To go as far as we can possibly get, to go as far as God would allow, so that we may share the gospel good news, that we may herald the love of God to this nation who says there is no hope in this world anymore. To a world that says this is broken and we need to found a new world, we say God has come to found the world. Let's be on mission with him. Let's participate with him. Let's sacrifice with him so that we may have the opportunity to unlock that power of the gospel. Would you stand with me in closing prayer?